The Lillian Smith Book Committee welcomes you to this 40th session of the annual awards ceremony under the aegis of Southern Regional Council and, of course, the University of Georgia and Committee for the Book, which has a long and distinguished career in advocating human rights. One manifestation of this advocacy is the work of Lillian Smith, whose plays and essays were the focus of emotion and scandal during her lifetime. Her struggle to be heard, as she put it, took place in a history of Euro-Americans speaking out for the rights of African Americans in times in the South when it was life-endangering to take such a stance. How proud she would have been to hear the acceptance speech of Barack Obama for the presidency. We at the SRC continue her legacy today with the giving of this prize to two authors we consider to be concerned with the issues that defined her literary oeuvre and discussions in print at the camp for young people which her family ran in the hills of Georgia. Dr. Hogan's valuable work, Many Minds, One Heart, on the history of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Dr. Crespino's book, In Search of Another Country, on an aspect of Mississippi and Southern history, add new information and analysis to our knowledge that are invaluable. I would like at the moment to introduce Joseph Crespino, who has written a book about Mississippi, which I think maybe many in Mississippi did not expect.
Thanks so much. I want to thank the Southern Regional Council, the University of Georgia Libraries, and the Georgia Center for the book for this wonderful award. I'm so pleased to win this award, and to win this award in particular. I had a good friend of mine, Todd Moy, who's a friend of mine, and as well as Wesley's, and his mother is in the back of the room right here. Todd is a distinguished historian at the University of Texas. And Todd emailed me earlier this week and congratulated me on this award. And he said to me, I think of all the book awards out there that we could win, that would be the one I'd like to win the most. And I think, and he said that, and it struck true for me as well. And I think that's true for a couple of reasons. One is if you go through the list of people who've won this award, it's just striking. You've heard already some of the winners. Some of the ones that stood out to me on this list: C. Van Woodward, George Tyndall, John Edgerton, Will Campbell, and that's not even including the creative artists, the novelists and the poets like Reynolds Price, Cormac McCarthy, Alice Walker, and my own colleague and good friend Natasha Trethewey, who won this award last year. So it's a distinguished group, and I'm so honored to be among them. But every award has its distinguished groups. I think what separates for me this award is its long association with the Southern Regional Council. The Southern Regional Council, anyone from the South or knows Southern politics, has been one of, if not the leading voice of progressive change in our region for the past 80 years. And so to have my work affiliated in any small way with the work of the Southern Regional Council is very gratifying and humbling for me. So it's a real honor to accept this award today. I want to thank two people who are here in the audience before I say a little bit about my book. The first is my wife, Caroline, who is here, who is with my daughter, Carrie, and I'm so glad that they could be here today. Caroline is an artist in her own right, and we have two children, and it's hard sometimes to balance child rearing and being a creative artist on two ends, and we're able to do that, and thanks in large part to her, so I'm glad to recognize her. I want to recognize as well my good friend, Reverend Kenneth Dean, who's over here. Reverend Dean was the head of the Mississippi Council on Human Relations in the mid-'60s, which was basically an organizing state-level group that was organized by the Southern Regional Council. So he worked very closely with the Southern Regional Council. And I contacted Reverend Dean, just kind of cold call, emailed him with some questions about Mississippi because he knew so much, and he wrote back with a 10-page single-spaced email response, and I knew right away that I had to get to know this man and that we had to develop a friendship. And we did develop a friendship, and one that enriched the book and has enriched my life over the last couple of years. So it's a real pleasure to have you here, Reverend Lee. I want to say a little bit about how I came to write this particular book. This book is about white Mississippians' response to the moral and political challenge of the modern civil rights movement. And I chose Mississippi in part because Mississippi has always figured as the most recalcitrant and reactionary southern state. But I chose it as well because I'm from Mississippi. And where I'm from had a lot to do with how I wrote this book and why I wrote it. I'm from a very small town called Macon, Mississippi. And my mother's side of the family has been in Macon since, for many generations, since before the Civil War. And I was born in 1972. I came of age in the late 70s, early 80s. And I often tell my students that we have a very impoverished notion of when the civil rights movement actually existed. It began in '54 with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, or with Rosa Parks and the bus boycott, and it ended in '68 when Dr. King was killed. But in truth, the civil rights movement, for towns like Macon, Mississippi, the civil rights movement didn't end in 1968. The civil rights movement hadn't even gotten there in 1968. And it wouldn't get there until the late 1970s and into the 1980s. And so I grew up in a town where the legacies of racial segregation were still very much alive and still very much present. I went for the first 8 years of my schooling to an all-white segregated academy that was founded in 1968 explicitly to avoid public school desegregation. It was a big deal in my town growing up when I was a kid, when I had black kids over to my driveway and we played pickup basketball. The neighbors would call my mother. It was a town in which, racial divisions were still very stark and very alive and very tangible. And I was able to leave Macon, Mississippi, and go off to school in Chicago, and I got involved in a community organizing project on the near west side of Chicago in what was then the Henry Horner homes. And when I got there and I was working in Chicago in college, I met so many people who were refugees of the Jim Crow South small towns, people who had left towns like Macon and Indianola and Winona, all these small towns across the Deep South, and had moved to Chicago. And I began to realize during that work, and I began to see, Chicago is one of the most segregated big cities in all of America. And you begin to see the racial isolation, the sense of segregation that existed in Chicago. And I think that experience was very important for me in gaining that perspective about how pervasive issues, of legacies of racial inequality and injustice are in our region and in our country. And I think it shaped the way I wrote this book. I didn't want to solely write a book about Mississippi as a closed society, even though Mississippi was a closed society in the 1960s. And Jim Silver was the author of that book, Mississippi, the Closed Society, in 1964. And he saw firsthand the kind of racial authoritarianism that had come to the fore in my home state of Mississippi during that time. And he was a wonderful eyewitness to it. But I also wanted to write a book that could recognize Mississippi's peculiarity in terms of the depth of its racism and the pervasiveness of its inequality, but one that could also, we as Americans, could put Mississippi in a broader national context and understand that the racial inequality and the legacies of racial injustice that exist in Mississippi are not a Southern problem. They're not a Mississippi problem, but they're a national problem. And so I wanted to write a book about Mississippi in which you can kind of connect the racial conservatism of white Mississippians with the racial conservative of other white Americans, whether they were in Mississippi or California or New York or Chicago or Illinois or Detroit or wherever. And so that was the kind of goal of my book. It was not to exonerate in any way the racism of white Mississippians, but it's to implicate the nation in the legacies of racial injustice that are part of our national and not just regional or state history. So that's a little bit about how the book relates to my own background. And I'd love to talk to you more about it afterwards, but I don't want to take up too much of Leslie or anybody else's time. So thank you very much for being here today, and thanks again.
We are happy to present this award, I've got it the right way around, to Joseph Crespino for his valuable addition to Southern history and USA history. As you pointed out, this has a broader context than just Indianola, Mississippi. This is a small token of our
Thank you so much.
appreciation.